this was an object that had been made under horrific conditions, I could actually go and view this artifact for myself because it is housed in the Montreal Holocaust Museum.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. The Book of Life's Canadian correspondent, Anne Dublin, spoke to author Anne Renaud after she won the 2018 Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Fania's Heart, a Holocaust picture book for older readers. It's the true story of a heart-shaped birthday card created in Auschwitz at great personal risk by women prisoners from scraps of fabric, stolen materials, and glue made out of bread and water for the 20th birthday of fellow prisoner Fania Landau-Feiner. The real heart is now in the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and it's one of the few surviving objects created by prisoners of Auschwitz. Let's hear now from the two Annes, and be sure to check out bookoflifepodcast.com to see the documentary that inspired the writing of Fania's Heart.
Anne Renaud is the winner of the 2018 Canadian Jewish Literary Award in the Youth category for her Holocaust picture book, Fania's Heart, illustrated by Richard Rudnicki and published by Second Story Press in Toronto. Anne Renaud is the prolific writer of books for young people, both fiction and nonfiction. Her nonfiction books are based on historical events, such as the sinking of the ocean liner, the Empress of Ireland, or Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the first place many immigrants landed on their arrival in Canada. But Anne also writes some wonderful fiction books for children, such as Missuk's Snow Geese, which takes place in Canada's far north. Anne Renaud's books have been shortlisted for numerous awards in Canada, including the Silver Birch, the Red Maple, and the Red Cedar. I spoke to Anne Renaud in Montreal via Skype. Anne Renaud, welcome to the Book of Life podcast. So let's begin by talking about you. Can you tell us about your early life growing up?
Yes, I was born not too far from Montreal and lived the first 10 years of my life in Beauharnois, which is a small town about half an hour from Montreal. And then my parents moved to northern Quebec in the Abitibi region, and we lived there for another 10 years. And then I moved to Ottawa for 1 year for university, and then to Montreal to study translation at Concordia University. And I never left Montreal. So I've been living here for, if I do the math, I would say about 40 years or so now.
Do you remember from your childhood any particular influence on you, either books that you liked to read or how you started writing?
I didn't write much as a child other than composition at school, which I really enjoyed. But books were a very big part of my life. My parents and my siblings, we read an awful lot. We had an entire wall of books in the living room, and my very, very first job, my first summer job when I was 15 years old, was working in a library. So books did play a big part in my growing up.
Do you remember any particular authors that appealed to you when you were young?
I do remember reading Judy Blume, and specifically, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, where I really thought that this woman was living in my head, because the protagonist of that book, her concerns and her angst, they were exactly what was of concern to me at that time. That book really, really spoke to me.
As it did to a lot of girls that age. I remember that well myself. I've had a lot of pleasure reading your books. I went to my local library and took out every one of your books that I could get my hands on. And I really felt connected to the topics that you wrote about. So how do you choose what to write about, Anne? What grabs you?
For my nonfiction, I gravitate towards subjects which I find interesting, that I feel young readers will find interesting, and upon which there have not been any books already written. So, for example, for the Empress of Ireland, and certainly the Canadian Tulip Festival, which was my very first book, I couldn't find anything on that topic. And because I wasn't really interested in duplicating something that was already available, that is the criteria. My first criteria is, have there been any books already written about, and do I feel passionate enough to be living with this topic for what could be years, because sometimes the research will take that long. And so do I feel passionate about the topic? And so for the Canadian Tulip Festival, that had a very special significance for me, because my uncle had been part of the troops that were involved in liberating the Netherlands. So I wanted to include his story in that book, which I did. And then again, Pier 21 I thought was a fascinating place. Again, the Empress of Ireland. And I wrote also a book for 9 to 12-year-olds on the Nova Scotia giantess Anna Swan, who I had never heard of before, but I sort of stumbled upon her story while I was researching another one of my books. And so that's really how I choose my topics.
I think it's very important to choose those stories that people haven't heard about before. I keep saying or thinking, how many more books about Anne Frank or Albert Einstein or Harry Houdini do we need? I want to hear the stories that people don't know about. And it's wonderful that you find them and do such a beautiful job telling those stories.
Thank you.
So, Anne, let's talk about Fania's Heart. Would you tell our listeners a bit about the story?
Well, Fania's Heart, I became aware of the story through a documentary that was made by a Montreal documentarian who put together this film. And I believe it was released in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. It's called The Heart of Auschwitz. And it told the story of how this birthday card had been made within the confines of Auschwitz by these women who were slave laborers and worked in this munitions factory. And I was very taken by this story, because although this was an object that had been made under horrific conditions, there were many themes that ran through this story, and among them hope and courage and love and resilience. And so that's why the story spoke to me so much, and also the fact that I could actually go and view this artifact for myself, because it is housed in the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And so once I had seen this documentary and viewed the heart for myself, I then contacted the director, Cal LeBlanc, and asked if he could put me in touch with Sandy Fainer or Fania Fainer, and he did. He provided me with their email addresses, and so I contacted Sandy, who was Fania's daughter, and she was extremely generous and supportive of the project. I explained that I wrote children's books and that I thought that this was a very important story that needed to be shared with young readers. And so that's how I came to write the story, Fania's Heart.
That's an amazing story about how an object then connects to a story, connects to a film, connects to real people. Some people wonder if children should be exposed to Holocaust literature and at what age. So what do you think the age is appropriate for Fania's Heart?
In writing it, I really struggled with the age of the audience and what I needed to leave in and what I needed to leave out of the story. I think that the version that was ultimately published would be appropriate for, I would say, 8 to 11. Clearly, older readers will connect with the story, but I think that target audience for that particular book would be about 8 to 12, 8 to 11 years old.
Yeah, I think you're right. And when I first call Fania's Heart a picture book, I don't really mean that. I mean it's more an illustrated book for slightly older children than what we consider picture books are. So I think you're right on about the audience, Anne. What question do you wish someone would ask you about Fania's Heart?
Well, I do know that people wonder if Fania is still alive, and she is. Fania is still alive. She will be celebrating her, I believe, 94th birthday this December, and she still lives in Toronto, and her daughter Sandy also lives in Toronto. And ultimately, Fania's greatest triumphs are her children and grandchildren. I thought that it was important for readers to know that she did, in addition to surviving, she did live a full and wonderful life, despite all the horrors that she had gone through. And at the end of the book, in my author's note, I do provide some details on Fania and what happened to her once Auschwitz was liberated, and how this birthday card survived and made its way to Montreal, ultimately.
So the message of hope is still there. I think it would be, if I can use the pun, very heartening for a child to read the book, to see the illustrations, but then to read your afterword and to see the photos of real people and the photo of the heart, the card that still exists. As I understand it, it's one of the few artifacts that remains from Auschwitz. So congratulations for writing such a heart-warming and heart-rending story. I have to admit I was crying at the end. Last question, Anne, and this is always a tricky question to ask an author, but would you tell us what you're working on now, or if you have a new book coming out soon?
My next picture book biography is on Frank Epperson, and he is credited with inventing the popsicle, and that book will be coming out sometime in 2019. And I do have other stories that are in the works. I do hope to have more books for children beyond 2019.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure our listeners will look forward to reading those books and enjoying the stories that you tell about these little-known places and people. Thank you for sharing your writing life with our listeners. It's been a pleasure meeting you via Skype. And merci, félicitations.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I greatly appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Paula Scheuer. I'm known as the Kosher Baker, and I'm a chef and author of 4 Jewish cookbooks, both dessert and food. And I'm very happy to be on the Book of Life podcast coming up. And I would like to dedicate my episode to the memory of my parents, Toby and Reuben Marcus, whose losses inspired me to write this book, and creating these recipes helped heal me, and I offer them to the world in my new book, The Healthy Jewish Kitchen, to help bring more nourishment to everyone's life.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/Book of Life. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.